Appreciate inviting me, Jeff. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of context for some background. At least this may have abated a little bit since the crisis, but I feel like there's been a little bit of a shift the last few years in the sense of the academic research mission is coming under attack, and particularly at public universities like the University of Texas and other big state universities. What are you providing for society? You know, if you're training people in quantum physics, you can see it, but do we want to pay for people to professors big salaries to teach about Hemingway? Well, what about these people over the business school? Are they doing anything that's relevant? So, you know, I strongly disagree that at least the research being done in the business school is frivolous and not central to the academic mission of education. And I believe that it's important that educational universities be thought leaders in research and not just proactive in teaching what's being done. But and I think that academic research has positive externalities, but sometimes those externalities are hard to see and quantify. I will give some caveats to that, though, that there is a sizable amount of academic research, even in finance, which may have little practical relevance. And as I maybe knock other people in this, I will say I participated in a lot of that research myself. So it's sometimes we're recycling debates that are left primarily within academic circles. I mean, gosh, should we have 6 factors on the model, French 3-factor model? I think that would be a terrible topic for a PhD student to start out at. Should we be producing research? I think we should be producing research and weighing in on some events that are relevant today. And as Mike pointed out in his talk, he kind of gave a timeline of how the research had developed and how some things in industry happened, and then you saw people doing research after it. I think part of the problem is some of the things happened in 1980, and people are still doing research on that like 25 years later, and they don't realize like why we're doing research on it, or maybe we're doing research on it. Like if you take like IPOs is a good area which I've done research, but the amount of research done in IPOs is proportional to the size of the market when we have other complex products like structured products that are receiving relatively little research. You've got IPOs that has like 200 papers. What's that?
I should add structured products to the list.
Yeah. So I think we have to look at the events going on today and try to look at what's hot. Jeff just mentioned he was on a board, and we need to start thinking about what people in industry are thinking about some of the problems that they're dealing with. So my advice is, first of all, do work that is relevant. And I have some filters on that. Well, does it answer a question which is of economic interest? Is it relevant to understanding something we don't know about, something in the real world that we don't, or preferably even making it better? One test, certainly not the only test, because we tend not to teach the brightest students, tend not to be MBA students, but one test would be like, can you explain it to your MBA students, you know, or at least a smart non-finance person. And one hand is to talk to people in industry, see what's going on, and what are the issues they're struggling with, and then to not be afraid to step outside the box. Now you have to realize that's potentially a little riskier if you write a paper that there's not a whole lot of other research being done. But it could have a lot of advantages too, like if there's, you know, if there's already 1,000 IPO papers, then it's a little tough to carve out your space. You know, you may think that you've got the contribution, but you probably haven't even read those other 1,000 papers, so you don't know for sure, right? Or even on the next private factor model, there's already so many papers out there, and you surely can't read all the other papers. All right, so yeah, so I'm going to give you one potential way, but there's other ways to do that. So one thing I would say just to think of in terms of you're going to spend your career in the area or areas you pick. And so I would think that, and this took me a while to come here, that publication should not be your main goal in life. You know, if your main goal is just to receive journal space on the shelf, then you'll be disappointed when your paper sits on the shelf and not many people are emailing you about that paper. So it would be, I think the best researchers, and this is conjecture, are people that really enjoy the work they do. They do the work, not necessarily getting the paper in the journal is part of the goal, but it's not the only goal. They enjoy the work that they do, and they think that they're working on something that has meaning and purpose, and they like the topics they pick. Understanding something about the world and the way the world works. And I think you can tell that because the researchers that are doing it just to get in the journal, once they get tenure, then they stop publishing, and the other people just keep publishing. And even though the rewards are not as steep. So pick topics you're passionate about, working about something you can see meaning and purpose in, some significance, some application towards the real world would help you in that regard. And I would say, ask yourself, is there some area of society that you can examine and potentially even influence? So I'm going to give you one example of that. It's certainly not the only example. I think there's lots of examples, but I'm going to pick this topic because it's the one I've been working in. That was one of the convex combinations that Jeff gave, and also it's an area that I think is a real growth field, but it's not receiving a lot of attention, probably because the authors that are writing papers in the field don't really see themselves as like in an area, because it's all different areas. But let me give you some examples. So here's a simple example, definition: examination of anything potential illegal in financial markets. I would like to broaden that definition and say research of financial activity, which is potentially, and that potential is very important, illegal, illicit, and/or immoral. And when I say potentially, the reason I'm emphasizing that is because I think, just like Jeff mentioned, shedding light on something is useful. And maybe you shed light on the area, you say everything is above board in this area, but if there's some questions or some reasons to be examining that, then that's useful. And it may be harder to get those papers published, but thanks to Matt Spiegel, I was able to publish one of those papers. But I think for past events, I would look at this Christy Schultz paper kind of as a great example. We'll talk a little bit about it. The survey papers here by Ritter and Zitzowitz. And so the Ritter paper is the last big finance survey paper. And so, well, I think why this area, it serves a purpose to more fully understand events. And we like to see like emails, people read things in the press. But if we look at the financial crisis, let's face it, our opinions, a lot of people are largely colored by some emails and what pundits said, some news articles said. They're colored by books written by practitioners like Michael Lewis, The Big Short. He's telling a story about some people he meets, and next thing you know, or Michael Lewis writes this book, Moneyball, and next thing you know, these congressmen are bringing people through, asking them about insider trading, high frequency trading and front running. But these are topics that academics also do work in. And so it's interesting to say whether these are one-off examples, Michael Lewis examples, or whether they're more systematic. It's also intellectually challenging. I think it has some positive externalities to help administer justice and can help guide policy in the future. Avoid costly misallocation. One criticism is it could be focused on these small topics. So I think we have to be careful to look at the topics, maybe that those topics are relevant, but perhaps those even smaller topics could have bigger implications if they're examples of something bigger going on. So here's the Christy Schultz study. And basically what they saw is that on NASDAQ, they like to quote on the quarters, and the quarter, the half, 0.75. But on the NYSE, it was much more symmetric. They like to quote on the eighths as well. But they avoided the odd eighths on NASDAQ. And so he just has a very complete paper documenting why this is and what the alternative hypothesis might be, and comes up with really the collusion hypothesis seems most likely and some of these other hypotheses can be ruled out. Now, what did this lead to? It led to a Department of Justice investigation, SEC, over $1 billion legal settlement led to lots of reforms in NASDAQ and the way markets are monitored even today. And likely it saved investors billions of dollars in the future, and the way that they were paying higher spreads for these stocks. So that's an example of, I hate to say it, but I haven't actually looked at their site count, but I imagine their site count is not near what, let's say, one of the French papers that were published around the same time was. But you could probably say that this paper perhaps made the biggest impact of the decade. It did win the Smith-Breeden Prize, but in terms of having a practical impact. So if you write in this area, your impact may be more practical and not necessarily on citations. So here's some examples of recently published papers, and I was surprised even getting these papers that the area has grown since I put together a list last time. So these are all papers since 2013 and mostly 2014. And here's a lot of papers about political connections and lobbying, okay? And again, I'm using this kind of broad area for forensic finance. So, lobbying, political connections, and we see that political capital, stock ownership, people in Congress, there's increasingly a lot of data on political connections. And so that's, I think, a lot of what's behind all this movement is more publicly accessible data and using kind of like big data techniques that we've pioneered in finance for years, applying these to different areas like political connections. So here's some examples about performance manipulation. Here, hedge funds, there seems to be increasing glowing evidence that hedge funds lean towards the tape, or at least cook the books at times. Although McLean and Pontiff and co-authors here say that that's actually not the case, and here's a good example of a counter paper. But they've created a nice debate in this literature here. And then there's insider trading is always an area. But it's not quite, it's been around for a while, but not growing. Here's unethical corporate culture and CEO behavior. Here's some papers, and I think this is a good example of foreign corporations and the culture of transparency. And looking at Russian data, I think that emerging markets, and Andrew Crowley points this out, that markets outside of the US are under-researched. And we know there's a lot of, we at least hear or perceive that there's a lot of culture, corruption going on in emerging markets, but we don't understand how that influences the market. Atif Mian has a paper in the JFE just showing that the pump and dump behavior of market makers in Pakistan, but it's a really neat paper because it shows that perhaps that's the reason why the Pakistan stock market doesn't develop, is because the market makers are engaged in insider dealing. Here's a paper by Andy Puckett as well. So here's, what about the crisis, credit rating agencies / borrowers, and here's some papers on misreporting, mortgage misreporting, nice papers by Mark Hermes and Pokorski, Saru, and Witkin, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my paper that's very similar to theirs. And then lax monitoring and securitization as well, rating agencies. And here's just more one-off type papers, but and this relates to an earlier literature about analysts here, mutual fund families, and I think these other areas are probably where you should be looking. Like these are areas, political connections probably is harder to get something done there. So let's come back and see why these things might matter. Let's talk about the root economic cause of the crisis. I'm going to shift focus and give you some examples from my research. And I think you'll see that these aren't like totally forensic papers, but they give you an idea for, I think, why I think these areas are interesting. In terms of the crisis, we think about conflicting incentives and agency problems and financial complexity. And there's competing academic views. One view is the originate to distribute view, and basically that people were originating loans but not really caring about the ultimate performance of those loans. And then there's some pushback on that channel, but I'm going to focus on not on the other side of the debate here, but I'm going to look at this potential securitization conflict. And here's the various areas. There's rating agencies, underwriters, managers, loan monitors, originators, appraisers, loans. This is all makes up the securitization chain. Most of the research actually being done on the first two, not much on these bottom areas might make it good. But when we think about the crisis, we think of all these things as having potential conflicts, but we know that there's also ways to mitigate these potential conflicts. And so the question is whether these are mitigated or not. Here's some papers about rating agencies, and basically this abstract paper said that, well, rating agencies had a decline in standards from 05 to 07. They also found this with CMBS market. Stanton and Wallace found this. And then I had a paper with Dragon Tang where we found that rating agency models were making, the part that went beyond their model was getting more lenient over time. And we examined why that was. And then there was this large literature that developed to kind of separate these two. Was it rating shopping, kind of just like, well, this is the way the market is set up? The market is set up for people to shop for ratings, and because of this, it leads to low ratings, so we should change the market design. Or is it the way the market's set up, but is it also the case that rating agencies are catering, or there's this race to the bottom, that rating agencies are all trying to please the customer, and the end result of the customer was the rating agency, the customer was the investment bank, the customer not being the people that are buying the products. So that instead of competition being a good thing, in this case, competition actually leading to laxer ratings. How am I doing on time, Jim?
Take a couple more minutes.
Oh, we're almost done? Okay. So, I'll just skip through this to get to the conclusions here then. This is a paper that talks about the role of reputation and why people might actually burn their reputation. Michael Lasbach was the editor on this paper, so if you see any flaws here, it was his fault. So anyway, basically, I don't think there's any flaws in the paper, but basically one of the things we showed is that with complex assets, and complexity is a feature of our securities today, that you could actually, people might want to burn their incentive, because the key result is that with complexity, securities aren't analyzed in the next period. It could be a long period before you find out the true quality of the security. Like the complex products that are being built today, we're not going to find out if they're really good until the next economic downturn. So it looks like the structured products being produced today are great. I actually believe that they're probably overstated, but not as much as in the previous crisis, but we won't find that out until the next market downturn. And then we'll have a debate about this again and wonder why. So this is a paper we had about mortgage misreporting, and we looked at who are the people, not just was there misreporting, but who engaged in misreporting, and we found it was a variety of people, but the underwriters, the loan originators, we pin those at the top. The appraisers engaged in misreporting, and to some extent, borrowers engaged in owner occupancy misreporting. I'll just skip through this. It wasn't, one interesting thing coming out is that people that painted this originally were wrong. It wasn't just a problem with these low doc loans. Misreporting was actually very common in full doc loans, and we know that from also some government investigations as well. A lot of these full doc loans actually weren't full doc loans; they were no doc loans, and they just stamped full doc on them. So these banks, did the banks engage in misreporting? We see a debate in the Wall Street Journal and other places, and JP Morgan's responding, "Hey, we didn't do anything wrong. Gosh, they're just, the government's trying to cubbyhole us because they made us buy all these other banks that engaged in misreporting." But in our paper, we found it's not the case. JP Morgan was actually number 2. These are the securities that they underwrote. They were number 2 misreporter in the crisis, so they were rampantly engaged in misreporting. So we have evidence on these first 2 channels, but we don't have a lot of evidence on some of these other areas. This is a good area. But also I think there's more areas moving forward. But I think this is an area where it shows us that the originate to distribute model is a good starting point, but it's worse than that. The system actually pushed out bad loans. Why? Because the underwriter was in the driving seat, and the way to make the most profits was not just to, was if you could push good loans off as bad. So, did that have implications? In a working paper, we showed that the regions of the country that had the most misreporting had the largest increase and decrease in housing prices. So the housing bubble, lots of pundits have reasons behind it. But yeah, but in Arizona, even within an MSA, if you look at the zip codes that have high misreporting versus those that don't, so we do zip code match stuff. The zip codes that had the most misreporting increase, a huge amount relative to the ones that didn't have misreporting. I think this has forward-looking, a lot of thoughts about this. There's lots of discussion about making new laws and what kind of laws should be made, and I think that's an important area for academics to weigh in. It's clear that most policy is made not looking at academic research, but I would also think that this area has an important externality in terms of the importance of justice, because I think that we often think in today's society justice is just like well, who cares, putting somebody in jail, what does that do for society? But it creates the incentives going forward. And so if the expected profit or fraud is greater than the probability of getting punishment times the fine, then you know what? It's profitable to engage in fraud, and without ethics, companies are going to engage in wide-scale fraud, and that may have wide negative externalities. Particularly with complex securities, this probability of punishment is low, but with academic research, we can actually work to increase that probability of detection because we have more time on our hands and can navigate complex things. So I think that's why forensic finance has a positive and forward-looking ramifications. So future research, I'm pushing this field because I think it can grow as a research field. Your primary goal is probably, I'm saying your primary goal is not necessarily to get published, but there's a lot of this research being published. I didn't enter this area to get my research published, but I haven't had any problems getting my research published in this field. And there's no shortage of questionable finance activities to examine. Unfortunately, there's lots of these. And we're getting richer and bigger data sets, although it's oftentimes hard to get our hands on these data sets. Maybe you need to talk to some people in the industry. And I think just in terms of general suggestions, talk to people on Wall Street. If there's people in your PhD class that decided to go elsewhere, talk to them. They're a good source of data and information. Read blogs, read the paper, and look for these areas. Try to spot them ahead of time. And there's lots of work to do. Thanks.
John, thank you.